I heard the screaming before I even entered the Valentino mansion. 2 identical voices, raw with exhaustion and fury, echoing through marble halls at 3 in the morning. And when the head housekeeper thrust a crumpled resignation letter into my trembling hands and fled past me into the night without so much as a backward glance, I realized with a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach that I was about to become the 23rd nanny to fail Dante Valentino's twin sons in 6 months. Though at that moment I had no idea just how dramatically these 2 small boys would reshape every corner of my carefully guarded heart. The iron gates had closed behind me with a finality that felt like a prison door slamming shut. And as I stood there on the circular driveway with my single battered suitcase at my feet, staring up at the sprawling estate that looked more like a fortress than a home with its towering stone walls and windows that gleamed like watchful eyes in the pre-dawn darkness, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of desperation had driven me to accept a live-in maid position at the notorious Valentino estate. Though I knew the answer perfectly well, because my grandmother's medical bills had been piling up like autumn leaves, and my art student stipend barely covered my own rent, let alone the experimental treatments that might give her a few more precious years. The screaming intensified as I approached the massive double doors, and I could hear the sound of something heavy crashing against a wall, followed by a man's deep voice barking orders in rapid Italian that my limited understanding of my grandmother's native language couldn't quite decipher, though the fury in his tone needed no translation whatsoever. A young woman in a maid's uniform yanked open the door before I could knock, her eyes red-rimmed and wild with something that looked uncomfortably close to terror, and she grabbed my arm with surprising strength as she hissed, "Run while you still can. They're devils, those boys, beautiful little devils who haven't slept more than 2 hours at a time since their mother disappeared. And the boss, he's worse than the children because at least they cry and scream and show you what they're feeling. But him, Dante Valentino, he's like ice wrapped around a volcano. And when he finally erupts, God help anyone standing too close." She released me just as quickly as she'd grabbed me and disappeared into the night, leaving me standing in the palatial foyer with its crystal chandeliers and Renaissance paintings and marble floors so polished I could see my own uncertain reflection staring back at me. A 23-year-old woman with paint perpetually under her fingernails and hope perpetually dying in her chest, wondering what kind of hell I'd just walked into for the sake of money that would save my grandmother's life, but might very well cost me my own sanity. The screaming was coming from upstairs, and I followed the sound like a moth drawn to a flame, climbing the sweeping staircase with my heart hammering against my ribs, because no one had actually told me what to do or where to go, and the mansion felt like a living thing around me. All shadows and secrets and the kind of wealth that came from activities people like me didn't ask questions about if we valued our continued breathing. I found the source of the chaos on the 3rd floor, in a nursery that had probably once been beautiful, but now looked like a war zone, with toys scattered across expensive carpets, and books torn from shelves and 2 small dark-haired boys standing in the center of the destruction, like tiny generals surveying a battlefield, their faces identical masks of exhaustion and defiance, their eyes so dark they looked black in the dim lamplight, and their mouths open in screams that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than their small bodies should have been able to produce. 3 women in medical scrubs were trying to approach them with what I assumed were sedatives, and 2 security guards stood by the door looking helpless and uncomfortable. And in the corner, partially hidden in shadow, stood a man who could only be Dante Valentino himself, and even from across the room I could feel the weight of his presence like a physical force, could see the rigid set of his shoulders beneath his expensive suit, and the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides as he watched his sons scream themselves hoarse without making any move to comfort them. He was devastatingly handsome in the way that dangerous things often are, with sharp cheekbones and a jaw that looked carved from granite, and dark hair that fell across his forehead, despite his obvious attempts to maintain control over even that small detail. And when his eyes finally cut to me standing frozen in the doorway, I felt the impact of his gaze like a physical blow, because I had never in my entire life seen eyes so utterly devoid of hope, so completely resigned to suffering that my breath caught in my throat, and I had to grip the doorframe to steady myself. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, in a voice like gravel and silk mixed together, not even bothering to frame it as a question, because men like him didn't ask. They demanded. And I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could form words, one of the twins noticed me, and his screaming cut off mid-breath as he stared at me with those impossibly dark eyes. And within seconds, his brother had stopped too. Both of them fixed on me with an intensity that felt like being examined under a microscope by scientists trying to determine whether I was friend or foe. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling than the screaming had been, and I could feel everyone in the room staring at me now, waiting to see what I would do. Whether I would run like all the others, or whether I possessed some quality that might finally break through to these two traumatized children who had forgotten what it felt like to feel safe enough to sleep. "I'm Sienna Moretti," I finally managed to say, directing my words at Dante Valentino even though I couldn't seem to tear my eyes away from the twins. "I was hired as a maid. I'm supposed to start tonight. I have my things downstairs. I didn't know where to go, and I heard the commotion, and I thought maybe someone might need help." Something flickered across Dante's face that might have been amusement if his features hadn't been so locked down in that mask of controlled fury, and he gestured sharply to dismiss the medical staff and the guards, who filed out with obvious relief, leaving me alone with him and his sons in a room that suddenly felt too small despite its generous proportions. "A maid," he repeated, his accent curling around the words in a way that made them sound both exotic and vaguely threatening. "You were hired to clean floors and change linens, not to interfere with my son's medical care, so I suggest you return downstairs and wait in the servants' quarters until someone can show you to your room and explain your actual duties, which do not, under any circumstances, include entering this wing of the house or speaking to my children." His words should have sent me running, should have made me gather my suitcase and walk right back through those iron gates and take my chances with my grandmother's medical bills. But something about the way the twins were still staring at me, silent now, but vibrating with a tension that looked like it might shatter them from the inside out, made me take a step into the room instead of backing away from it. "They're exhausted," I said softly, keeping my voice gentle and my movements slow because I'd grown up around traumatized things, had volunteered at animal shelters and foster programs, and knew that broken creatures needed patience more than they needed force. They're so tired they can barely stand, but they're too frightened to let themselves sleep, and sedating them won't fix what's actually wrong because what they need isn't medication. What they need is to feel safe. And you can't force safety. You can only create the conditions for it, and then wait and hope that eventually trust grows in the space you've made for it. Dante moved then, crossing the room in 3 long strides, until he was standing close enough that I could smell his cologne. Something dark and expensive that probably cost more than my entire semester's tuition. And when he leaned down so his face was level with mine, I could see flecks of amber in those deadly dark eyes, and the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, and the tiny scar that cut through his left eyebrow. And I realized with a strange detachment that I was probably about to be thrown out of this house, or possibly worse, because men like Dante Valentino didn't appreciate being told what their children needed by maid girls who knew nothing about their lives. "You think you understand my sons after 30 seconds of observing them?" he said in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, though somehow that made it more threatening than if he'd shouted, "You think you know better than the child psychologists, and the sleep specialists, and the pediatricians who have been trying to help them for months? You think you have some magical insight that everyone else has missed? Is that right? Sienna Moretti, who was hired to scrub my toilets and wash my sheets." I should have apologized, should have backed down and played the role of the submissive employee who knew her place. But something about the desperation hidden beneath his anger, something about the way his hands were still clenched into fists, and the muscle jumping in his jaw, and the shadows under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping much better than his sons, made me stand my ground, even though my knees were shaking beneath my jeans. "I think," I said carefully, choosing each word like I was defusing a bomb, "that sometimes the people closest to a problem are too deep inside it to see the simple solutions, and I think that those boys aren't screaming because they're difficult or broken. They're screaming because they're trying to communicate something that no one is listening to closely enough to understand, and I think that maybe, just maybe, if someone actually asked them what they needed instead of telling them what they should need, you might finally get some answers that could help. For a long moment, Dante just stared at me, and I couldn't read the expression on his face. Couldn't tell if he was about to have me thrown out or arrested or disappeared to wherever people who challenged him ended up. And then one of the twins did something that changed everything, took 3 small steps forward until he was standing right in front of me, and tilted his head back to look up at my face with those enormous dark eyes that were exact replicas of his father's, and in a voice hoarse from screaming, he whispered, "What's your name?" "Sienna. I told him, crouching down so we were at eye level, aware of Dante's dangerous stillness behind me, but unable to ignore this small boy who was looking at me like I might be the answer to a question he'd been asking for months. "My name is Sienna. What's yours?" "Luca," he said, and then gestured to his identical brother, who had moved closer as well, drawn by the conversation like a cautious animal emerging from hiding. "That's Matteo. We're twins, but I'm older by 4 minutes, so I'm supposed to take care of him. But I'm too tired and I can't sleep because Mama comes in my dreams, and she's always crying and calling for help. And when I wake up, she's gone again, and it hurts so much I can't breathe." The words tumbled out of him in a rush, like he'd been holding them inside for so long they'd built up pressure behind his small ribs, and beside him, Matteo nodded frantically, his own eyes filling with tears as he added, "We try to tell Papa, but he gets sad and angry when we talk about Mama, so we stopped, but the dreams didn't stop, and now we're scared all the time, and no one understands except maybe you. You look like you understand. Do you understand, Sienna?" I felt something crack open in my chest, some careful wall I'd built around my heart after my own parents died when I was 7 years old, and I'd spent years having nightmares about the car accident and waking up screaming just like these boys. And I understood in that moment exactly what they needed, because it was the same thing I'd needed all those years ago. The thing my grandmother had given me when no one else knew how. "I understand," I whispered, reaching out to gently touch Luca's dark hair, and then Matteo's, feeling them lean into the contact like plants turning towards sunlight. "I understand because I lost my mama and papa when I was not much older than you, and I had the same kinds of dreams, the ones where I could see them but couldn't reach them. And I was so scared to sleep because I knew the dreams would come and they would hurt so much. But my grandmother, she taught me something that helped. Would you like me to show you?" They both nodded eagerly, desperately, and I could feel Dante's presence behind me like a thundercloud ready to break. Could sense his tension and his suspicion, and his barely controlled hope warring inside him. But I blocked him out and focused entirely on the twins because in this moment they were all that mattered. I began to hum, soft and low, an old Italian lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me, Ninna Nana. The words about stars and sleep and protection. And I watched as both boys' eyes went wide and then soft, as their small bodies began to relax for the first time, probably since I'd arrived, as they swayed slightly to the gentle melody that carried promises of safety and comfort and the kind of love that transcends even death. Matteo moved first, climbing onto the small couch in the corner of the nursery and curling up with his head on the armrest. And Luca followed immediately, tucking himself against his brother's back. And I continued humming as I found a blanket among the chaos and gently draped it over them, watching as their breathing began to slow and deepen, and their eyes began to drift closed. And when I finally fell silent, they were asleep, truly asleep, their small faces peaceful in a way that made my throat tighten with emotion. I turned slowly to face Dante Valentino, prepared for his anger or his dismissal or whatever punishment he deemed appropriate for my presumption. But what I saw in his face stopped me cold because the mask had slipped completely, and I was looking at a man who had just witnessed something he'd thought impossible. A father who had been drowning in helplessness and had just been thrown an unexpected lifeline. and the raw vulnerability in his expression was so intense I had to look away, because it felt too intimate, too private, like I was seeing something I had no right to witness. "How?" he said, and his voice was rough with suppressed emotion, breaking on the single word. "How did you do that when 22 professionals failed, when I've spent months watching my sons destroy themselves from lack of sleep, and I couldn't fix it, couldn't help them, couldn't even comfort them because every time I tried, they just screamed louder? So tell me, Sienna Moretti who scrubs toilets, how did you do in 5 minutes what I couldn't do in 6 months?" I met his eyes then, saw the dangerous combination of gratitude and suspicion, and something else I couldn't quite name burning in those dark depths, and I knew that my answer would determine everything that came next, would either open doors I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through or close them forever. And in that moment, standing in a destroyed nursery with 2 sleeping boys and their devastatingly damaged father, I made a choice that would change all of our lives in ways I couldn't possibly have predicted. "I listened," I said simply. "I listened to what they were trying to tell everyone, and then I gave them what my grandmother gave me, a piece of home and comfort that reminded them they're not alone in their grief. But Mr. Valentino, I need you to understand something. This won't last. They'll wake up in an hour or 2, and the nightmares will come back and they'll start screaming again, because one lullaby can't fix months of trauma. What they need is consistency and patience and someone who understands that healing isn't a straight line. It's a messy, complicated journey that takes time and dedication and a willingness to sit with them in their pain instead of trying to medicate it away or force them past it." The look he gave me then was so intense I felt it like a brand on my skin, a claiming and a challenge and a warning all wrapped into one searing gaze. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed into something that sounded almost like a threat wrapped in velvet, smooth and dangerous and impossible to ignore. "You'll stay," he said, not asked, commanded. "You'll stay and you'll help my sons sleep and you'll tell me everything you know about trauma and nightmares and healing, and in return I'll pay you more than you could make in 10 years of scrubbing floors. I'll pay off whatever debts brought you to my door. I'll give you anything you want, but you don't leave, you don't quit, you don't run like all the others because Sienna Moretti, you just became the most valuable person in this entire mansion, and in my world valuable things are protected, controlled, and never ever allowed to escape." The twins slept for exactly 93 minutes before the screaming started again. And I was there when they woke because I'd never left the nursery, had spent the entire time sitting on the floor beside their couch, watching the rise and fall of their small chests, and wondering what kind of devil's bargain I'd just made with a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm. Warning. A man who commanded an empire built on violence and fear and loyalty, purchased through methods I didn't want to contemplate too closely, though I suspected I'd learn soon enough given that I'd apparently just agreed to become something far more complicated than a simple maid in his household. Dante had disappeared after our conversation, though I'd felt his presence in the hallway for at least 30 minutes after he left, could sense him standing just outside the door, listening to his sons breathe peacefully for the first time in what must have felt like an eternity. And when he finally walked away, I heard his footsteps echo through the mansion like gunshots, heavy with the weight of a man who carried too many burdens and didn't know how to set any of them down, even for a moment. When Luca and Matteo jerked awake simultaneously, their screams tearing through the pre-dawn quiet like sirens, I was ready with the lullaby, humming it softly as I moved to sit on the edge of their couch. And this time they reached for me immediately, their small hands clutching at my shirt with desperate strength as they buried their faces against my shoulders and sobbed with a grief that seemed impossibly large for such small bodies to contain. "She was crying again," Luca gasped between sobs, his breath hot against my neck as he trembled violently. "She was in a dark room and she was calling for Papa and for us. And she sounded so scared, Sienna. She sounded so scared and I couldn't help her. I couldn't reach her no matter how hard I tried." Matteo was crying too hard to speak, just nodding frantically against my other shoulder, and I wrapped my arms around both of them and continued humming, rocking gently back and forth the way my grandmother used to rock me when the nightmares came. When I would wake up convinced I could still smell the gasoline and hear the crunch of metal, and see my parents' faces in those final terrible moments before everything went dark. "I know," I murmured when the lullaby ended, keeping my voice steady even though my own eyes were burning with unshed tears, because their pain was so raw and real it felt like breathing in smoke. "I know it's scary, and I know it hurts, and I know you feel helpless because you want to save her but you can't. But I need you both to listen to me very carefully. Can you do that? Can you listen even though it's hard?" They both pulled back enough to look at my face, their eyes red and swollen, and so full of anguish that my heart physically ached for them. And they nodded in unison with that eerie synchronization that twins sometimes have, as if they were two halves of the same soul split into separate bodies. "The dreams you're having, they're your mind's way of trying to process something terrible that happened, something you don't fully understand yet because maybe no one has explained it to you properly, or maybe you're not ready to hear it, but your mama, she loved you so much, loves you so much, and wherever she is, whatever happened to her, I promise you she's not scared anymore, and she doesn't want you to be scared either," I said carefully, choosing my words like walking through a minefield, because I didn't actually know what had happened to their mother, didn't know if she'd abandoned them or died or been taken. But I could see in their faces that they needed to believe she was at peace, needed permission to let go of the terror that was consuming them from the inside out. "How do you know?" Matteo whispered, his voice hoarse and small and breaking on every syllable. "How do you know she's not scared? How do you know she's okay? Nobody will tell us anything, and Papa won't talk about her, and all the grown-ups just say she's gone, but they won't say where or why or if she's ever coming back." Before I could answer, the nursery door opened, and Dante stood there in the doorway, still wearing the same suit from hours earlier, though now it was rumpled and his tie was gone and his hair was disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. And when he looked at me holding his sobbing sons, something dangerous and desperate flashed across his features, an expression that made me think of caged animals willing to chew off their own limbs to escape the trap they'd found themselves caught in. "You two, back to bed," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Sienna and I need to talk now, in my office, and this conversation is not negotiable." The twins immediately began protesting, clinging to me with renewed desperation as they begged him not to take me away, promising they'd be good if I could just stay. And I saw something crack in Dante's carefully controlled expression, saw him flinch as if their words were physical blows, before he crossed the room and crouched down in front of us so he was eye level with his sons. "She's not leaving," he said, and his voice had gentled into something that sounded almost human, almost vulnerable. "She's going to stay here and help you, but right now I need to talk to her about grown-up things, boring things about schedules and rules and payment, and then she'll come right back, I promise you. But you need to let her go for a little while. Can you do that for me? Can you be brave for just a few more minutes?" Luca and Matteo looked at each other in that wordless twin communication way, some silent conversation passing between them that I couldn't interpret, and then they slowly, reluctantly, released their grip on my shirt and nodded, though Luca made me promise 3 times that I would come back before he would let me stand up and follow Dante out of the nursery. The walk to his office felt like a march to an execution, our footsteps echoing through hallways lined with priceless artwork and antique furniture that probably cost more than my grandmother's entire house. And when he finally opened a heavy wooden door and gestured for me to enter ahead of him, I stepped into a room that looked like something out of a movie about organized crime. All dark wood paneling and leather furniture and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes in Italian and English, and what looked like Russian. And behind a massive mahogany desk hung a painting of a beautiful woman with kind eyes and dark hair holding 2 infant boys. And I knew without being told that I was looking at Isabella Valentino, the twins' mother whose absence haunted every corner of this mansion. Dante closed the door behind us and moved to stand behind his desk, though he didn't sit, just gripped the back of his leather chair with white-knuckled hands as he stared at me with an intensity that made me feel like I was being dissected and examined and catalogued all at once, as if he was trying to determine whether I was a gift from God or a threat to be eliminated. "I need to know everything," he said finally, his accent thickening with emotion in a way that suggested he was too tired to maintain his usual perfect control over his English. "I need to know how you knew what they needed when armies of specialists couldn't figure it out. I need to know what your angle is because no one does something like this out of the goodness of their heart, especially not for a man like me. So tell me, Sienna Moretti, what do you really want? What's your price? What's the catch that I'm not seeing yet?" His suspicion should have offended me, should have made me angry at being accused of having ulterior motives when all I'd done was comfort two traumatized children. But I understood it because men like him didn't survive in worlds like his by trusting people. And I could see in the tension of his shoulders and the defensive set of his jaw that he was terrified of hoping. Terrified of believing that someone might actually be able to help his sons without demanding something impossible in return. "There's no catch," I said quietly, moving to stand in front of his desk, though I didn't sit either, matching his posture because something told me that showing weakness right now would be a mistake. "I told you the truth earlier. I lost my parents when I was 7 years old in a car accident, and for 2 years after that I had nightmares every single night, dreams where I could hear them calling for me but I couldn't reach them, couldn't save them, couldn't do anything but watch them suffer over and over again, and the only thing that helped was my grandmother singing to me, holding me, letting me talk about my parents instead of trying to make me forget them or move on before I was ready." Something shifted in Dante's expression, a minute softening around his eyes that suggested my words had hit some target I hadn't been consciously aiming for, and he finally released his death grip on the chair and walked around the desk to lean against it, crossing his arms over his chest in a gesture that was probably meant to look casual but came across as deeply defensive. "The doctors said the boys needed routine and stability, and to avoid triggers that reminded them of their mother," he said, and I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice now, the beginning of understanding that maybe the experts he'd been paying hadn't been giving him the right advice after all. They said talking about her would make it worse, would prevent them from adapting to the new reality, would keep them stuck in their trauma instead of helping them process it and move forward. "The doctors were wrong," I said bluntly, because sugarcoating the truth wasn't going to help anyone in this situation. Grief doesn't work like that. You can't just pretend the person never existed and expect traumatized children to magically adapt. They need to remember her, they need to talk about her, they need to know that loving her and missing her is okay and natural and not something they have to hide or feel ashamed of. And right now they're having nightmares because their unconscious minds are trying to process emotions they're not being allowed to express when they're awake. Dante was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on my face with an unreadable expression. And then he did something completely unexpected. He laughed, though it was one of the most bitter and broken sounds I'd ever heard, devoid of any actual humor, and filled instead with self-recrimination and regret. "So I've been making it worse," he said. And it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact delivered with the kind of harsh self-awareness that comes from someone used to cataloging their own failures. "I've been following expert advice and paying thousands of dollars for therapy and medication and sleep studies, and all I've been doing is teaching my sons that their grief is unacceptable, that their love for their mother is something shameful that needs to be hidden away. I've been hurting them while thinking I was helping them." The pain in his voice was so raw and real that I found myself taking a step closer to him without consciously deciding to move. Found myself wanting to offer comfort to this dangerous man who had probably never needed comfort from anyone in his entire adult life. And when I spoke again, my voice had gentled into something softer, something that acknowledged his suffering, even as I pushed him to confront uncomfortable truths. "You were doing the best you could with the information you had," I said carefully. "But now you have different information, and the question is what you're going to do with it. Whether you're going to keep following the experts who haven't helped, or whether you're willing to try something different. Something that might actually work, but requires you to be vulnerable and open and willing to let your sons see you grieve too. Because right now, I think they're not just scared about their mother, they're scared about you. Scared that if they talk about missing her, they'll make you even sadder than you already are. Dante's jaw clenched and unclenched several times, and I watched him wrestle with whatever demons were clawing at his insides, watched him try to maintain his composure and failing, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, thick with emotion he was no longer able to fully suppress. Isabella didn't leave us, he said, each word seeming to cost him something precious. She was taken, kidnapped by a rival family 8 months ago, and I've been searching for her ever since, tearing apart the city looking for any trace of her. But it's like she vanished into thin air. And the twins. They keep asking when Mama's coming home, and I can't tell them the truth because the truth is, I don't know if she's even still alive. I don't know if I'm searching for a person or a body. And I can't bear to see the hope die in their eyes when they realize I might never be able to bring her back to them. The confession hung in the air between us like something physical and heavy. And I understood then why he'd been so distant with his sons, why he'd buried himself in work and delegated their care to professionals, because every time he looked at them, he saw her, saw what he'd failed to protect, saw the family he'd been unable to keep safe despite all his power and money and connections. They need to know, I said gently but firmly, because as much as I sympathized with his pain, I knew that keeping this secret was destroying all 3 of them. Maybe not all the details, maybe not the violence or the danger, but they need to know that their mother didn't choose to leave them, that she would come back if she could, that you're looking for her and haven't given up. Because right now they're creating narratives in their heads that are probably worse than the truth. And those narratives are poisoning their dreams and stealing their ability to feel safe. And what happens when I have to tell them she's dead? Dante asked, and the rawness in his voice nearly broke something inside me. What happens when all those months of hoping and searching end with a body and a funeral, and the final permanent loss of the only person they've ever loved more than each other? How am I supposed to help them survive that when I don't even know if I can survive it myself? I wanted to tell him that everything would be okay, wanted to offer him false comfort and empty promises. But I'd learned a long time ago that grief didn't respond well to lies. So instead I told him the truth. The hard truth that no one wants to hear but everyone needs to know. You survive it the same way anyone survives unbearable loss, I said softly. You wake up every morning even when you don't want to. You put one foot in front of the other even when every step feels impossible. You let yourself fall apart when you need to, and you let the people who love you hold you together until you can do it yourself again. And eventually, not quickly and not easily, but eventually, the grief becomes something you carry instead of something that carries you, and you learn to live with the hole in your heart, because the alternative is giving up. And you have 2 boys upstairs who need you to keep fighting even when fighting feels pointless. Dante looked at me for a long moment. Really looked at me. As if seeing me for the first time as something other than a convenient solution to his immediate problem, and what I saw in his expression made my breath catch in my throat, because it was gratitude and recognition and a dangerous kind of connection that had nothing to do with his sons, and everything to do with the way 2 broken people sometimes recognize their own damage reflected in someone else's eyes. I'm going to make you an offer, he said finally, his voice steady now, though still rough around the edges. And I need you to think very carefully before you answer, because once you accept, there's no going back, no changing your mind, no deciding that this is too complicated or too dangerous, or too much responsibility for someone who came here to scrub floors and make beds. He paused, and I could see him choosing his words carefully, could see the weight of whatever he was about to propose settling over him like a cloak. I want you to become my son's official nanny, not a maid who helps out when needed, but their primary caregiver, the person responsible for their physical and emotional well-being, the person who sleeps in the room next to theirs and is there when they wake up screaming and teaches them how to process their grief in healthy ways, instead of letting it consume them, he continued, moving closer to me with each word, until we were standing near enough. that I could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, and smell his cologne and feel the heat radiating off his body. And in exchange, I will pay off your grandmother's medical bills in full. I will pay off your student loans. I will give you a salary that most people with master's degrees don't make. And I will protect you with the same resources I use to protect my own family, which means no one will ever threaten you or harm you, or even look at you wrong without answering to me personally. It was a generous offer, impossibly generous, the kind of offer that could change my entire life and my grandmother's life, and give us financial security we'd never dreamed of having. But I could hear the unspoken conditions beneath his words, could sense that accepting his money and his protection meant accepting his control, meant becoming part of his world in ways that would complicate everything I thought I knew about right and wrong. And what if I decide this isn't working? I asked, needing to understand the parameters of this devil's bargain before I signed my name in blood. What if 3 months from now I realize I'm in over my head, or the boys need someone with actual training, or you decide I'm not doing a good enough job? What happens then? Do I get to walk away, or am I trapped here until you decide you're done with me? Something dark and possessive flashed across Dante's features, and when he smiled, it wasn't a comfortable expression. It was the smile of a predator who'd just spotted prey and was deciding how best to corner it. You're trapped here the moment you say yes, he said with brutal honesty, because my sons will become attached to you, will come to depend on you, will start to heal because of you. And if you try to leave after that, you'll destroy them all over again, and I won't allow that. I can't allow that. So understand this, Sienna Moretti. If you accept my offer, you're not just accepting a job. You're accepting responsibility for 2 traumatized children who will love you with everything they have. And that kind of love is a chain you can't break without causing irreparable damage. So choose carefully. Choose wisely. And choose now, because my sons are upstairs, probably terrified that you're never coming back, and I need to know whether to send you away tonight or give you a room and a contract and a place in this family that you won't be able to escape from, even if you eventually want to. I should have said no, should have walked away from this dangerous man and his traumatized children and his world of violence and secrets, should have chosen safety and simplicity and a life that didn't involve making deals with devils. But when I closed my eyes, I could see Luca and Matteo's faces, could remember the desperate way they'd clung to me, could feel the weight of their grief pressing against my chest, and I knew that I was already too involved to walk away, that somewhere between hearing their screams and singing them to sleep, I'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade. I want one condition added to this arrangement, I said, opening my eyes to meet Dante's intense gaze directly. I work for your sons, not for you. Which means that if I think something you're doing is hurting them, I'm going to tell you, and you're going to listen, and we're going to figure out together what's best for them, even if that means you have to do things that make you uncomfortable or vulnerable or scared. Because those boys deserve a father who's present and engaged and willing to process his own grief, instead of hiding from it. And if you can't agree to that, then I don't care how much money you're offering. I won't stay. For a moment, I thought I'd pushed too far. Thought I'd see anger or offense flash across his features. But instead, Dante threw his head back and laughed. Really laughed this time. And the sound was so unexpected and so genuine that it transformed his entire face, made him look younger and less dangerous and almost approachable, though I suspected the impression was deceiving. You have no idea what you're agreeing to, he said, when he finally stopped laughing, shaking his head with something that might have been admiration or might have been amusement at my naivety. You're going to push me and challenge me and probably make me want to strangle you at least once a week. And I'm going to resent you for it, and fight you on it, and make your life difficult because I'm not used to people telling me what to do in my own house. But yes, Sienna, yes, you can work for my sons. And yes, you can call me out when I'm being a terrible father. And yes, I will try, and I do mean try, to listen to you even when every instinct I have is telling me to assert my authority and remind you exactly who's in charge around here. He extended his hand to me then, an old-fashioned gesture that felt strangely formal, given everything that had just passed between us. And when I placed my hand in his, I felt the calluses on his palm and the strength in his grip and the heat of his skin against mine. And something electric passed between us that had nothing to do with our negotiation and everything to do with the dangerous attraction I'd been trying very hard not to acknowledge since the moment I first saw him standing in his son's destroyed nursery, looking like a fallen angel who'd forgotten how to fly. "Welcome to the family, Sienna Moretti," he said. And the way he said my name, drawing out the syllables with his accent curling around each letter, made something low in my stomach tighten in a way that felt distinctly inappropriate, given that I'd just agreed to become his employee and his son's caregiver. "I'll have Greco, my second in command, show you to your room in the morning and go over all the details of your contract and your responsibilities. But right now, I think 2 small boys are probably convinced you've abandoned them, so let's go reassure them before they destroy what's left of their nursery." We walked back upstairs together in silence, and when we entered the nursery, we found Luca and Matteo sitting on their couch, wide awake and holding hands, their faces lighting up with such pure relief when they saw me that I felt my eyes sting with unshed tears. And when they both launched themselves at me simultaneously, nearly knocking me over with the force of their embrace, I knew that Dante had been right. I'd just bound myself to these children in a way that would be nearly impossible to break. And as I held them close and began humming their lullaby again, I caught Dante watching us with an expression so complex and layered that I couldn't begin to unravel all the emotions tangled up in his dark eyes. But what I did see clearly was hunger. Not for me necessarily, but for what I represented. For the possibility of healing and hope, and a future where his sons smiled more than they screamed, and I understood in that moment that I hadn't just agreed to help 2 traumatized children. I'd agreed to try to save an entire broken family, and the weight of that responsibility settled over my shoulders like armor, heavy and uncomfortable, but somehow exactly what I needed to be wearing as I stepped into a world where love and violence existed side by side, and the line between protector and prisoner was thinner than I'd ever imagined possible. 3 months passed in a strange blur of routine and chaos, of sleepless nights spent singing lullabies and sun-drenched afternoons watching Luca and Matteo slowly, tentatively, begin to remember what it felt like to be children instead of prisoners of their own grief. And somewhere in the middle of helping them heal, I realized that I'd stopped being just their nanny and had become something far more complicated, something that felt dangerously close to family, though I knew better than to voice that thought aloud in a house where every relationship was tangled up in threads of loyalty and obligation and the kind of love that could turn possessive without warning. The twins were sleeping through the night now, most nights anyway, waking only occasionally from nightmares that were less frequent and less violent than they'd been when I first arrived, and I'd learned to recognize the signs that a bad night was coming. The way Matteo would cling a little tighter during bedtime stories, or how Luca would ask more questions about his mother than usual. And I'd adjusted my approach accordingly, staying closer, singing longer, letting them talk about Isabetta until the words ran out, and sleep finally claimed them in its gentle embrace. What I hadn't anticipated, what no one had warned me about or prepared me for, was Dante himself. The way he'd begun watching me with an intensity that had nothing to do with my care of his sons, and everything to do with something darker and more primal, something that made the air between us feel charged with electricity whenever we occupied the same space, which was happening with increasing frequency as he'd started joining us for meals and bedtime routines and random moments throughout the day when he would appear in doorways or hallways and just observe, his dark eyes tracking my every movement, like I was some kind of puzzle he couldn't quite solve. I'd noticed it first about 6 weeks into my employment, the way his hand would linger on my waist when he passed me in the narrow hallway outside the twins' room, his fingers pressing against the curve of my hip, with just enough pressure to send heat spreading through my body in ways that made me feel guilty and confused, because he was my employer, and I was supposed to be focused on his children, not on the way his touch made my skin feel too tight, and my breath come too fast. Then there were the late-night encounters in the kitchen, when I'd come downstairs for tea after getting the twins settled and find him already there. Tie loosened and shirt sleeves rolled up. Drinking whiskey and reading reports that I suspected involved activities I was better off not knowing about. And he'd look up when I entered and something would flash across his features that looked like hunger wrapped in restraint. And we'd talk, really talk about everything and nothing, about his son's progress and my grandmother's improving health and the books he read and the art I used to paint before life got too complicated for creative pursuits. And those conversations felt more intimate than any physical contact. Felt like we were slowly, carefully, peeling back layers of ourselves and showing each other the raw, vulnerable places we kept hidden from the rest of the world. Greco had warned me, had pulled me aside after the first month, and told me in his gruff, protective way that the boss was developing feelings that went beyond gratitude or professional appreciation. That I needed to be careful, because Dante Valentino didn't do things halfway. Didn't know how to want something casually or maintain appropriate boundaries when his interest was engaged. And men like him, men who commanded empires and controlled lives and were accustomed to taking what they wanted, could be dangerous when they decided someone belonged to them, especially when that someone was already living under their roof and caring for the most precious things in their world. I'd dismissed Greco's concerns at first, told myself that Dante was grieving and confused and projecting his need for emotional connection onto the nearest available target, which happened to be me simply because I was there and I'd helped his sons and I represented some kind of hope in his otherwise dark existence. But then came the incident at the twins' private preschool, the moment when everything shifted, and I could no longer pretend that what was happening between Dante and me was simple or innocent, or something that could be neatly categorized and controlled. It had been a beautiful spring morning, the kind of day that made you believe winter was truly over, and warmth was here to stay. And I'd been walking Luca and Matteo to their classroom, holding their small hands and listening to them chatter excitedly about the art project their teacher had planned, when the black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb and 3 men in dark suits emerged with weapons drawn. And I'd had approximately 2 seconds to process what was happening, before instinct took over, and I shoved the twins behind me, using my body as a shield between them and the men who were advancing with cold, professional efficiency that suggested this wasn't a random attack, but a carefully planned operation. I remembered screaming at other parents to get their children inside, remembered the weight of Luca and Matteo pressed against my back as they clung to my legs, remembered the strange clarity that came over me as I realized I was probably about to die. But if I could just buy enough time for the school's security to respond, then maybe the boys would survive this. And that was all that mattered. That was the only thought in my head as the men got closer, and I spread my arms wider to make myself a bigger target, to make sure they'd have to go through me before they could touch the children I'd promised to protect. The gunshot had been deafeningly loud, and I'd felt the impact like a punch to my left shoulder. Felt the hot bloom of pain spreading across my chest and down my arm. But I didn't fall, didn't move, just kept my body between the twins and the men who were now shouting something in Italian that I couldn't process through the ringing in my ears and the adrenaline flooding my system. And then there were more gunshots, different ones, coming from behind me. And when I risked a glance over my shoulder, I saw Dante's security team had arrived, saw Greco himself putting bullets into the men who'd shot me with a precision that spoke of extensive training and zero hesitation. The rest of that day existed in my memory as a series of disconnected snapshots. Dante appearing seemingly out of nowhere and catching me as my legs finally gave out. The twins crying and reaching for me as someone tried to pull them away. The interior of Dante's car where he'd cradled me against his chest while screaming at his driver to go faster, his hands pressed against my shoulder trying to stop the bleeding, while he whispered things in Italian that sounded like prayers or curses, or maybe both. And then the private hospital where doctors swarmed around me, and Dante stood in the corner of the room, looking like violence personified, his suit covered in my blood, and his face a mask of such concentrated rage that even the medical staff gave him a wide berth. I'd woken up 12 hours later, in a hospital room that looked more like a luxury hotel suite, with machines beeping softly around me, and an IV in my arm, and a dull, throbbing pain in my shoulder that morphed into sharp agony when I tried to move. And sitting in the chair beside my bed, looking like he hadn't slept or showered or changed his blood-stained clothes, was Dante. And the expression on his face when he realized I was awake was something I would remember for the rest of my life, because it was raw and unguarded and so full of emotion that it almost hurt to look at him directly. "The boys," I'd managed to croak out, my throat dry and my voice barely above a whisper. "Are they okay? Are they safe? Did anyone hurt them? Please tell me they're okay." "They're fine," he'd said, and his voice had been hoarse, like he'd been screaming or crying or both. "They're with my mother at the estate. They're safe. They're being guarded by half my army. No one will get near them again. I promise you that. I swear on everything I am that I will never let anyone threaten them again." He'd moved from the chair to sit on the edge of my hospital bed, his hand coming up to cup my face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone who'd probably spent the last 12 hours orchestrating the violent destruction of everyone involved in the attack. And when he'd spoken again, his words had changed everything, had crossed a line we'd both been carefully avoiding for months. "You threw yourself between my sons and armed men," he'd said, his thumb stroking across my cheekbone with a tenderness that made my eyes sting with tears. "You took a bullet meant for them. You were willing to die to protect them. And Sienna, you need to understand what that means to me, what you mean to me, because I can't keep pretending that you're just their nanny, can't keep lying to myself that what I feel when I look at you is gratitude or respect or professional appreciation, because it's not. It's so much more than that. It's complicated and dangerous and probably completely inappropriate given our situation. But I can't stop thinking about you. Can't stop wanting you. Can't stop imagining a future where you're not just in my house taking care of my children, but in my bed and in my life in ways that have nothing to do with your job, and everything to do with the fact that you've become essential to me in ways I don't know how to explain." I should have told him he was confused, should have blamed his confession on the trauma of almost losing his sons and the relief of seeing me alive, should have maintained the professional boundaries that were supposed to exist between employer and employee. But the truth was, I'd been falling for him too, had been fighting against my attraction to him since those first late-night conversations in the kitchen, had been telling myself that the way my pulse raced when he entered a room, and the way I found excuses to be near him, and the way I dreamed about his hands on my body was just loneliness or proximity, or some kind of misplaced gratitude for the financial security he'd given me. But lying there in that hospital bed, with his hand on my face and his eyes burning into mine with unmistakable desire, I couldn't lie to myself anymore about what I was feeling. "I know I shouldn't feel this way," I'd whispered, because even though I was acknowledging the attraction, I still felt the need to voice all the reasons why acting on it would be a terrible idea. "I know you're my employer, and I'm supposed to be focused on your sons, and you're still grieving your wife, and this is probably the worst possible timing and the most inappropriate possible situation. But Dante, I can't stop thinking about you either. Can't stop noticing the way you look at me or the way my skin feels electric when you touch me or the way I feel safer and more alive and more seen than I've ever felt in my entire life when I'm near you." He'd leaned closer then, close enough that I could feel his breath against my lips, could see the war happening behind his eyes as he fought between what he wanted and what he thought was right. And when he'd finally spoken, his voice had been rough, with barely controlled desire, and something that sounded like desperation. "I'm still married," he'd said, and the words had felt like a confession and a condemnation all at once. "Technically, legally, I'm still married to Isabetta because I haven't found her body, haven't been able to declare her dead, haven't been able to close that chapter of my life. And Sienna, you deserve better than this. Better than a man who's still tied to a ghost. Better than someone who comes with my kind of baggage and danger and complications. You deserve someone whole and uncomplicated who can give you a normal life without armed guards and security protocols and the constant threat of violence. But God help me, I can't let you go, can't send you away, Can't stop wanting you even though I know I should." The pain in his voice had broken something inside me, had made me reach up with my good arm and pull his face down to mine despite the screaming protests from my injured shoulder. And when our lips had finally met, it had felt like something inevitable and dangerous and absolutely right, like two broken pieces finding their perfect fit. And the kiss had been soft at first, tentative, as if we were both afraid that acknowledging this thing between us would somehow make it more real and therefore more terrifying. But then his hand had slid into my hair, and mine had fisted in his shirt, and the kiss had deepened into something desperate and consuming. All the weeks of tension and restraint and carefully maintained distance finally burning away in the heat of our mutual need. We'd been interrupted by a nurse entering to check my vitals, and Dante had pulled away with obvious reluctance, his eyes dark with desire and conflict. And for the next week, while I recovered in that private hospital room, we'd existed in a strange limbo where the attraction between us was acknowledged but not acted upon, where he visited me every day and sat by my bed and held my hand and talked about everything except the kiss that had changed the fundamental nature of our relationship. And I'd let him, because I understood that he needed time to process what was happening, needed to figure out how to reconcile his desire for me with his guilt over his missing wife, and his fear that getting involved with me would somehow put me in even more danger than I'd already faced. The twins had visited me too, had climbed carefully onto my hospital bed and cried and told me I was the bravest person they knew and made me promise never to scare them like that again. And I'd held them as best I could with one arm in a sling and promised them I would always protect them, would always be there when they needed me. And over their dark heads I'd caught Dante watching us with an expression so complex and layered that I'd felt it like a physical weight on my chest. Had seen the love and fear and possessive need all tangled together in his gaze. And I'd known in that moment that whatever was happening between us, it was far too late to stop it. We were already too deeply entangled to walk away without causing damage to everyone involved. When I'd finally been released from the hospital and returned to the Valentino estate, I'd discovered that my room had been moved, was no longer in the staff wing, but in the family wing, directly, adjacent to Dante's master suite with a connecting door that he claimed was for security purposes, but we both knew was really about proximity, about wanting me close, about the inability to maintain proper distance when propriety demanded it, but desire overruled everything else. That first night back, after I'd gotten the twins settled and sung them their lullaby, and kissed their foreheads and promised them I was completely fine, despite the lingering pain in my shoulder, I'd found Dante waiting for me in the hallway outside my new room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes tracking my approach with that now familiar intensity that made my stomach flip and my skin feel too sensitive. "We need to talk," he'd said, and I'd nodded because I knew we did. Knew we couldn't keep existing in this state of acknowledged attraction without addressing what it meant or where it could possibly go. So I'd unlocked my door and invited him in, hyper-aware of the fact that we were alone together in my bedroom for the first time, hyper-aware of the massive bed dominating the space and the way he was looking at me like he wanted to devour me whole, but was holding himself back through sheer force of will. "I had Isabetta declared legally dead," he'd said without preamble, the words dropping between us like stones into still water. "3 weeks ago, while you were in the hospital, I finally accepted what I've known for months, that she's gone, that she's not coming back. That continuing to search for her was just my way of avoiding the grief and the guilt and the crushing weight of failure. So I had my lawyers file the paperwork, and I signed the documents. And as of last Tuesday, I am officially a widower, which means legally and morally and in every way that matters, I am free to pursue this thing between us if that's what you want." His confession had stolen my breath, had made my heart race for entirely different reasons than fear or adrenaline, because I understood what it had cost him to let go of that last thread of hope. Understood that declaring Isabetta dead meant accepting responsibility for failing to save her. Meant telling his sons that their mother was never coming home. Meant closing a chapter of his life that he'd been desperately trying to keep open, despite all evidence that doing so was causing more harm than good. "Have you told the boys?" I'd asked, because that seemed like the most important question. The one that would determine whether this new development would help them heal or traumatize them further. And Dante had nodded, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I'd learned meant he was struggling with difficult emotions. I told them yesterday, with my mother there to help, with their child psychologist present to provide support. And Sienna, you were right. You've been right about everything. They needed to know, needed to have closure, needed permission to grieve properly instead of existing in this limbo, where they were afraid to mourn because they thought it meant giving up hope, he'd said, and his voice had cracked slightly on the last few words, revealing the depth of emotion he was working so hard to control. They cried, they raged, they asked questions I couldn't answer about why bad things happen to good people, and whether their mama is in heaven and if she can see them from wherever she is, and it was the hardest conversation I've ever had in my entire life. But afterward, after the tears stopped and we'd talked ourselves out, Matteo asked if this meant I could smile again sometimes, and Luca asked if maybe now we could be happy without feeling guilty about it. And I realized that they'd been carrying the weight of my grief on top of their own, had been trying to protect me from their sadness, the same way I'd been trying to protect them from mine. I'd crossed the room then, closed the distance between us, and wrapped my good arm around him, pulled him against me and held him, while his carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely, and he buried his face against my neck and shook with silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul. And I'd stroked his hair and whispered meaningless comfort and let him break apart in my arms because he'd been holding himself together for so long that the relief of finally letting go was almost violent in its intensity. When he'd finally pulled back, his eyes were red and his face was wet, but some of the terrible tension I'd seen in him since the day we met had eased, as if crying had released some pressure valve that had been building toward explosion. And when he'd looked at me, his expression had been so open and vulnerable that it had made my chest ache with tenderness and desire all mixed together into something too complicated to name. "I want you," he'd said, simple and direct and devastating in its honesty. "I want you in every way a man can want a woman. I want you in my bed and in my life, and in my future, I want to wake up next to you and fall asleep holding you and build something new with you that isn't haunted by ghosts or weighted down by guilt. But I need you to understand what you'd be signing up for. Need you to know that being with me means accepting danger and violence and a world where armed guards are necessary and threats are constant. And I need to know if you can live with that. If you can choose this life knowing full well what it entails. Because Sienna, if you say yes, if you decide to be mine, then I will protect you and cherish you and give you everything I have. But I will also become possessive and demanding, and probably insufferably controlling, because that's who I am. That's what my world has made me, and I won't apologize for it even though I know I should. The smart thing would have been to say no, would have been to maintain my position as the twins' nanny and nothing more, would have been to protect my heart and my safety by keeping Dante at arm's length. But I'd never been particularly good at doing the smart thing, had always followed my heart even when my head was screaming warnings. And in that moment, looking at this powerful, dangerous, devastatingly broken man who'd just laid himself bare before me, I knew that I was already too far gone to walk away, that somewhere between singing lullabies to his traumatized sons and having late-night conversations in his kitchen and taking a bullet to protect his children, I'd fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Dante Valentino, and no amount of danger or complications or inappropriate timing was going to change that fundamental truth. "I choose this," I'd whispered, reaching up to cup his face the way he'd done to me in the hospital, mirroring his gesture and his vulnerability. "I choose you and this dangerous, complicated life, and whatever comes with it. Because Dante, I'm already in too deep to pretend otherwise, already too invested to walk away without destroying myself in the process, and maybe that makes me reckless or stupid or hopelessly naive, but I don't care. I want this. I want you. I want us, and I'm willing to face whatever consequences come from making that choice." He'd kissed me then, slow and deep and achingly tender, his hands cradling my face like I was something precious and fragile. And when he'd finally pulled away, we were both breathing hard, and my shoulder was screaming in protest from the way I'd pressed against him, but I didn't care because being in his arms felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering, felt like finding something I hadn't even known I was looking for. "The boys asked me something this morning," he'd said softly, his forehead resting against mine and his hands still framing my face. "At breakfast, right after we'd finished talking about their mother, Luca looked at me with those serious eyes he has and asked if you could be their new mama, not to replace Isabetta, but to be someone who loves them and takes care of them and stays with us forever." And before I could figure out how to answer, Matteo chimed in and said that you already felt like their mama anyway, that you sang to them and protected them and made them feel safe in ways no one else ever had. And I realized that they were right, that you've become essential to our family in ways that go far beyond your job description. And Sienna, I need to know if that terrifies you, if the idea of becoming not just my partner but their mother figure is too much too soon, because I can be patient about us, can take this slowly and let you set the pace. But my sons, they don't know how to be patient. They only know how to love with their whole hearts, and if you're not ready for that kind of commitment, then we need to figure out how to manage their expectations before anyone gets hurt. The question had hung between us, heavy with implication and possibility. And I'd thought about how much I already loved Luca and Matteo, how completely they'd worked their way into my heart, how being their nanny had stopped feeling like a job months ago and had become something closer to a calling. And I'd realized that I wasn't afraid of the commitment or the responsibility or the intensity of their love. What I was afraid of was failing them, of somehow not being enough to fill the hole their mother's death had left in their lives. "I love them," I'd admitted, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating to speak aloud. "I love them like they're already mine, like they've always been mine, and the thought of being their mother doesn't scare me. What scares me is the possibility that one day I'll let them down, or make a mistake, or not be what they need, and they'll realize I'm just a substitute, just a poor replacement for the mother they lost." Dante had kissed me again then, soft and reassuring, before pulling back to look directly into my eyes with an intensity that demanded my full attention and complete belief in what he was about to say. "You're not a replacement or a substitute. You're something entirely new and different, and exactly what they need right now. And Sienna, I know this is fast and unconventional and probably completely insane by normal relationship standards, but nothing about my life or my family or my world is normal. So I'm asking you, will you be with me? Really be with me? Will you let me court you properly despite the fact that you live in my house and care for my children, and we've already crossed about 17 different professional boundaries? Will you give us a chance to build something real and lasting that could eventually, when everyone is ready, become the kind of family my sons are already imagining in their heads?" And standing there in my new bedroom, with this dangerous, complicated, impossibly compelling man looking at me like I held the key to his salvation, I'd done the only thing that made any sense at all. I'd said yes, and sealed my fate with a kiss that promised everything and demanded nothing except the courage to keep choosing love even when fear and logic screamed that I was making a terrible mistake. 6 months had passed since that pivotal night when everything between Dante and me had shifted from unspoken tension into acknowledged desire. And those months had been the strangest and most beautiful of my entire life, filled with stolen moments of tenderness between his brutal business dealings and quiet family dinners where the twins chatted excitedly about their day, while Dante's hand found mine under the table, his fingers intertwining with my own in a gesture that felt both possessive and protective, a silent reminder that I belonged to him now in ways that went far beyond employment contracts or professional obligations. We'd been careful, so careful, to maintain appropriate boundaries in front of Luca and Matteo, to avoid confusing them or moving too fast when they were still processing their mother's death and learning how to exist in a world where Isabetta would never return. But the boys weren't stupid, weren't blind to the way their father looked at me now with softness instead of professional distance. weren't oblivious to the fact that I'd moved into the family wing, and that sometimes in the mornings they'd find Dante and me having coffee together in the kitchen, with a comfortable intimacy that suggested we'd already been awake for hours, though we never explicitly discussed what was happening between us, because some things were better shown than explained to children who'd already experienced too much loss. What I hadn't anticipated? What Dante had tried to warn me about? But I'd underestimated in my naive belief that love could somehow transcend the violence inherent in his world, was how being identified as his weakness would paint a target on my back, so bright and obvious that it was only a matter of time before someone tried to exploit it, and that time came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I was picking up the twins from their private preschool, walking them to the car with my hand wrapped around each of theirs, while we talked about the butterfly life cycle they'd been learning about in science class, completely unaware that 3 cars away, a team of armed men were waiting with instructions to take what Dante Valentino loved most and use it to destroy him piece by piece. The attack happened so fast that my brain couldn't process all the details in real time, could only capture fragmented images like photographs taken by a camera with a broken shutter. The black SUV screeching around the corner with its doors already opening. The men in tactical gear emerging with military precision, their weapons raised and their faces covered with masks that made them look inhuman and terrifying. And I'd had maybe 3 seconds to register what was happening before my body reacted on pure instinct, shoving Luca and Matteo behind me with enough force that they stumbled and fell onto the sidewalk while I spread my arms wide to make myself the biggest possible barrier between these men and the children I'd sworn to protect with my life if necessary. I'd screamed for help, screamed for anyone nearby to call security or the police or Dante himself, screamed until my throat felt raw and torn. But the school parking lot was mostly empty at this hour, and the few people who were present scattered like frightened birds at the first sight of weapons, leaving me alone with 2 terrified children clinging to my legs, and 4 armed men advancing with the kind of calm, unhurried confidence that suggested they'd done this many times before, and knew exactly how it would end. The first bullet hit me in almost the exact same spot as the last time, my left shoulder exploding in familiar agony that made my vision white out for a second. But I didn't fall, didn't move, just gritted my teeth against the pain and stayed standing, because the moment I went down these men would have clear access to Luca and Matteo, and I would die 1,000 times before I let them be taken, or hurt, or traumatized any further than they already had been by the violence that seemed to follow their father like a shadow. I heard Matteo screaming behind me, heard Luca crying and shouting for his papa, heard the men saying something in Italian that my pain-fogged brain couldn't translate, and then there was another gunshot. This one so close I felt the heat of it pass by my face, and I remember thinking with strange clarity that this was it. This was how I died. Shot in a preschool parking lot trying to protect 2 small boys who'd already lost one mother and didn't deserve to lose another person they loved. But then the sound changed, became a symphony of returning fire. And I realized that Dante's security team had arrived, that Greco was there with 6 men who moved with lethal efficiency, taking down the attackers with headshots that left no room for survival or mercy. I must have passed out at some point because the next thing I remembered with any clarity was being in Dante's arms again, his face hovering above mine with an expression that managed to combine murderous rage and devastating fear in equal measure. His hands pressing against my shoulder trying to stem the bleeding while he shouted orders in Italian that came out sounding more like threats than instructions. And through the haze of pain and shock, I could hear the twins crying somewhere nearby, could hear Greco's voice trying to soothe them while also coordinating with law enforcement. And I tried to tell Dante I was sorry for not being more careful, sorry for letting this happen again. But the words wouldn't come out right, and everything started going gray around the edges. The hospital was different this time. Not the private facility where I'd recovered from the first shooting, but somewhere else. Somewhere with armed guards stationed outside my room and security, protocols so intense that even the doctors had to show identification and submit to pat-downs before being allowed near me. And when I finally surfaced from the anesthesia and pain medication enough to be coherent, I found Dante sitting in the same position as last time, in the chair beside my bed, looking like he hadn't slept or eaten or done anything except watch me breathe and wait for me to wake up, so he could simultaneously express his relief that I was alive and his fury that I'd been hurt again because of my association with him. "This has to stop," he said, and his voice was so rough it barely sounded human, scraped raw by emotions he'd been holding back for however many hours or days I'd been unconscious. "This pattern where you throw yourself in front of bullets meant for my sons, where you make yourself a target to protect them, where you almost die because being part of my life makes you vulnerable to attacks from people who want to hurt me through the things I love most. Sienna, I can't keep doing this, can't keep almost losing you, can't keep watching you bleed because my enemies have figured out that destroying you would destroy me more effectively than any business maneuver or territorial dispute." He stood up then and began pacing the small hospital room like a caged animal, his hands clenched into fists and his shoulders rigid with tension. And I could see him working through something in his head, could see the war between what he wanted and what he thought was right playing out across his features, and I knew with sinking certainty what he was about to say before the words even left his mouth. "I've been thinking, while you were in surgery, and I was sitting there covered in your blood for the second time in 6 months, that maybe the most loving thing I can do for you is let you go," he continued, and each word felt like a knife twisting in my chest, more painful than the bullet wound in my shoulder. "Maybe keeping you here, keeping you close, making you part of my family and my life and my world, maybe that's the most selfish thing I've ever done, because yes, you make my sons happy, and yes, being with you makes me feel things I thought died with Isabetta. But what good is happiness if it comes at the cost of your safety? What kind of man am I if I claim to love you but continue putting you in situations where armed men hunt you in parking lots and shoot you while you're protecting my children?" I tried to sit up, tried to reach for him despite the screaming protest from my injured shoulder and the tangle of IV lines connecting me to various machines, tried to tell him that he didn't get to make this decision unilaterally, that I was an adult who'd chosen this life with full knowledge of the risks. But he held up a hand to stop me, his face settling into that mask of cold control I hadn't seen since the early days of our relationship, and I realized with growing horror that he'd already made up his mind, had already decided that pushing me away was the answer despite everything we'd built together over the past months. "I'm sending you away," he said, and the finality in his voice made my blood run cold. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere far from New York and my business and the violence that follows me everywhere I go. I'm going to set you up with enough money that you'll never have to work again, that your grandmother will have the best care available, that you can go back to your art and your studies and build a life that doesn't involve security details and bulletproof cars and the constant threat of being used as leverage against me and Sienna. I need you to understand that this isn't a negotiation. This isn't something I'm asking your permission for. This is me making the executive decision that your life is worth more than my happiness, or my son's attachment, or any feelings we've developed for each other." The words hit me like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last, and I felt tears streaming down my face as I finally found my voice, hoarse and broken, but determined to make him hear me, to make him understand that he was making a terrible mistake born from fear rather than love. "You don't get to do this," I managed to say, my voice shaking with pain and fury and desperate pleading all mixed together. "You don't get to make me fall in love with you and your sons and then rip me away from them because you're scared, because that's what this is, Dante. You're not protecting me. You're protecting yourself from the possibility of losing someone else you care about. And I understand that fear. I do. But running from it isn't the answer. Pushing away everyone who loves you isn't going to keep them safe. It's just going to leave you isolated and alone and unable to have any kind of meaningful connection because you're too terrified of loss to risk loving anyone." He flinched at my words as if I'd struck him, and for a moment I saw the mask crack, saw the devastating pain underneath, saw the man who'd already lost his wife and was now trying to prevent losing me by pushing me away before fate could rip me from his grasp. But then his expression hardened again, and he shook his head slowly, deliberately, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "Better alone than watching you die," he said quietly, and the resignation in his voice told me that nothing I said would change his mind, that he'd already committed to this course of action and would see it through no matter how much it destroyed both of us. Better isolated than standing over your grave knowing I could have prevented it by letting you go while you were still alive to build a life somewhere else, with someone else, someone who doesn't come with my particular brand of danger and darkness. Before I could respond, before I could mount any further argument against his terrible logic, the door to my hospital room burst open and Luca and Matteo rushed in with Dante's mother trailing behind them, looking apologetic and helpless, and the twins threw themselves at my bed with complete disregard for my injuries or the medical equipment, their small faces wet with tears, and their voices overlapping as they begged me not to leave them, not to go away like their mama did, and the sound of their desperate pleas broke something fundamental inside me, because I'd promised them I would always be there, had promised I would protect them and love them and never abandon them. And now Dante was asking me to break that promise for their own good, was asking me to become another loss in their young lives that were already too full of grief and trauma. Please don't leave us. Matteo sobbed against my good shoulder, his small body shaking with the force of his crying. Please, Sienna, we need you. We love you. You can't go away like Mama. You promised you'd stay forever, you promised. And looking at their devastated faces, at Dante standing in the corner with his jaw clenched and his hands fisted at his sides, at the impossible choice being laid before me between my own safety and the family I'd come to love more than my own life, I realized that there was no good answer here, no solution that would make everyone happy and keep everyone safe, and that sometimes loving people meant making impossible decisions that would hurt in the short term, but hopefully, eventually, lead to something better in the long run. Though in that moment, I had no idea what better could possibly look like when my heart was shattering into pieces that I wasn't sure could ever be reassembled into anything resembling whole. I made my decision in that hospital room while holding 2 sobbing children and watching their father wage war with his own demons. And what I decided was that Dante Valentino didn't get to make choices about my life without my consent, didn't get to push me away to assuage his own guilt and fear, didn't get to take the coward's way out by convincing himself that abandoning me was somehow an act of love rather than an act of self-preservation. So I looked him directly in the eyes with all the fierce determination I possessed, and told him that if he wanted me gone, he was going to have to physically remove me from this family, was going to have to be the villain who ripped me away from his sons while they screamed and cried, because I absolutely refused to leave willingly, refused to cooperate with his misguided attempt to protect me from a life I'd already chosen with full knowledge of the consequences. You're going to listen to me right now, I said, my voice steady despite the tears still streaming down my face and the pain radiating from my shoulder. And you're going to really hear what I'm saying instead of filtering it through your fear and your guilt and your conviction that everyone you love is destined to be destroyed. Because Dante, I didn't survive 2 shootings and fall in love with your complicated, damaged, beautiful family just to let you push me away because you're too scared to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could actually build something lasting and real, despite the danger, despite the violence, despite every rational reason why this shouldn't work. The twins had gone quiet in my arms, their tear-stained faces turned toward their father, with expressions that managed to combine hope and accusation in equal measure. And I could see Dante's resolve wavering, could see the cracks forming in his armor as he looked at the 3 of us together. A tableau that must have driven home just how much he would be destroying if he followed through with his plan to send me away. I've already lost her once, he said, and his voice was breaking now, all pretense of control abandoning him as the words poured out raw and unfiltered. I've already failed to protect someone I loved, already had to live with the knowledge that Isabetta died, because I wasn't smart enough or fast enough or careful enough to keep, her safe. And Sienna, I can't go through that again. Can't survive losing you too. Can't watch my sons lose another mother because I was selfish enough to let you stay when I knew the risks, when I knew that being associated with me makes you a target for every enemy I've ever made. I understood then what was really happening. Understood that this wasn't about protecting me at all, but about protecting himself from the possibility of another devastating loss. And something in my chest softened even as I maintained my resolve, because I could see how terrified he was. Could see the little boy underneath the ruthless Mafia boss. The boy who'd learned early that love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. "You can't control everything," I said gently, gesturing for his mother to take the twins out of the room because this conversation needed to happen, without their small ears hearing things that would confuse or frighten them. "You can't prevent every possible danger or eliminate every potential threat. And trying to do so by pushing away everyone who loves you isn't protection. It's prison. It's choosing to live in a cage of your own making because you're too afraid to risk the pain that comes with genuine connection. But Dante, that's not living. That's just existing, and I refuse to let you sentence yourself to that kind of half-life. Refuse to let you teach your sons that loving someone means eventually losing them. So it's better never to love at all." He crossed the room then, sank down onto the edge of my hospital bed, and buried his face in his hands. And I watched this powerful, dangerous man, who commanded an empire, completely fall apart. Watched him shake with sobs he'd probably been holding back since the moment he'd gotten the call that I'd been shot again. And I reached out with my good arm and pulled him against me. Let him cry into my neck while I stroked his hair and whispered that it was okay, that he was allowed to be scared, that fear didn't make him weak. It made him human. "I need you to make me a promise," I said when his crying had subsided into ragged breathing. "I need you to promise that you'll tell the twins the truth about their mother, the whole truth, not just that she was taken, but that you found her body weeks ago. That you've been carrying that knowledge alone because you were afraid of hurting them. Because Dante, they deserve to know. They deserve to have closure and understanding, and the chance to properly grieve instead of living in this ambiguous space where they're not sure what happened or why. And more than that, they deserve to see you grieve with them. To know that it's okay to be sad and angry and lost. That feeling those things doesn't make them weak or broken. It makes them survivors learning how to carry impossible weight." He pulled back to look at me, his eyes red and swollen, and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen them. And after a long moment, he nodded slowly, accepting the wisdom in what I was asking, even though I knew it would be one of the hardest things he'd ever have to do. The conversation with Luca and Matteo happened 3 days later in my hospital room, with all of us gathered on my bed and Dante holding both boys, while he told them in simple, honest language that their mother had died, that bad people had taken her and hurt her, and she wasn't coming back, but that she'd loved them fiercely until her last breath, and would want them to be happy and to live full, joyful lives despite the tragedy that had touched them so young, and the twins had cried and asked questions and raged against the unfairness of it all. But they'd also, finally, begun the real work of healing. The kind that comes from truth rather than carefully constructed lies designed to protect them from pain that couldn't actually be avoided, only postponed. 6 months later, I stood in the library where I'd first sung to the twins, wearing a simple white dress and holding a bouquet of wildflowers, watching Dante wait for me at the makeshift altar with an expression that combined love and gratitude and wonder in equal measure. And when the small ceremony was over, and we were officially, legally, permanently bound to each other, Luca and Matteo had rushed forward to hug us both, chattering excitedly about how they finally had a complete family again, how I was officially their mama now, even though I'd felt like their mama for months, and the joy on their faces had made every bullet wound and every moment of fear and every impossible decision absolutely worth it. We'd held a small memorial for Isabetta first, with the boys placing flowers on her grave and telling her about their new life, about how much they still loved her, but how they were learning to be happy again. And I'd stood beside Dante with his hand gripping mine, and understood that this was what real love looked like. Messy and complicated, and built on a foundation of shared grief and hard-won trust, rather than fairy tale romance and easy happy endings. The twins slept peacefully now, every single night. Their dreams no longer haunted by visions of their mother crying for help, but instead filled with memories of her smile and her laugh and the lullabies she used to sing. And sometimes I would stand in their doorway and watch them sleep curled up together like puppies, their small faces peaceful in the lamplight, and feel overwhelmed by the fierce protective love that filled every corner of my chest, the kind of love that made taking bullets seem like a reasonable price to pay for keeping them safe and whole and happy. Dante had kept his promise to protect me, had doubled his security, and eliminated the Costello syndicate with the kind of ruthless efficiency that reminded me exactly who I'd married. But he'd also learned to be present, to be vulnerable, to show his sons that strength didn't mean never breaking, but rather getting back up after you'd fallen apart. And watching him grow into the father his children needed while also being the partner I deserved had been worth every moment of fear and pain and uncertainty. Sometimes late at night, when the twins were asleep and we were alone in our bedroom, Dante would pull me close and whisper that I'd saved him, that I'd saved all of them. And I would remind him that salvation was a team effort, that we'd saved each other by choosing to be brave enough to love despite all the reasons why we shouldn't. And then he would kiss me with the kind of desperate tenderness that still made my knees weak even after months of marriage. And I would remember that girl who'd shown up at the Valentino mansion with a single battered suitcase, and no idea that she was about to find the family she'd been searching for her entire life without even knowing it. I'd been hired to scrub floors and change linens, had been desperate for money to pay my grandmother's medical bills, had walked into that fortress-like mansion expecting nothing more than a paycheck and maybe some stories to tell someday. But what I'd found instead was two small boys who needed someone to see past their trauma to the sweet, loving children underneath, and a broken man who needed someone to remind him that his capacity for love was stronger than his capacity for violence. And somewhere in the process of healing them, I'd healed myself, had learned that family wasn't always about blood or biology, but about choosing each other every single day, despite the fear and the danger and the absolute certainty that loving this deeply meant risking devastation if anything went wrong. We were a family forged in fire and sealed with scars, proof that sometimes the most broken pieces create the strongest bonds when you're brave enough to let them be fitted together, despite their jagged edges. And as I tucked Luca and Matteo into bed that night and sang them the same lullaby that had started everything, I understood with perfect clarity that I hadn't just changed their lives by refusing to run when things got dangerous. They'd changed mine by showing me that home isn't a place you find. It's a feeling you create with people who see all your damaged pieces and love you not despite them, but because of them. Because those pieces tell the story of everywhere you've been and everything you've survived. And that story, messy and complicated and absolutely imperfect as it was, had led me exactly where I needed to be, in a mansion that felt less like a fortress now and more like a sanctuary, with a husband who loved me fiercely and protectively, and two sons who'd stolen my heart the moment they'd stopped screaming long enough to let me sing them to sleep. And I wouldn't trade a single bullet wound or moment of terror for anything in the world. Because this, right here, this beautiful broken family we'd built from grief and hope and stubborn refusal to give up on each other, this was worth everything I'd risked and everything I'd lost to find it.